before further ado, I'm going to introduce the last speaker. We have Chelsea Macpherson from the Columbia University, and she's a PhD student working with Dr. Quinn, and her works revolves around exercise-induced plasticity and motor learning in neurodegenerative diseases. So today she's talking about prime motor learning through exercise in those with cerebral ataxia, a pilot study. Thank you, Chelsea, for joining us, and we are looking forward to your talk.
Okay, so I'm going to just share my screen, and we're going to get going on this one. All right, so I'm going to be presenting on priming motor learning through exercise in individuals with cerebellar ataxia. This is a pilot study. This is also a methodology sort of piece. So we're going to get going on this. I need to get rid of this little thing. Okay. So I'm just going to give a broad overview of what spinocerebellar ataxia is. It's an incredibly rare disease. It's neurodegenerative in nature, and it presents at any point from infancy to adulthood. There are so many types of spinocerebellar ataxia, as you can see, one all the way up to potentially 48. And the most common being SCA 3, followed by SCA 1, 2, 6, and 7. No, that doesn't work. Okay. So in terms of the spinocerebellar symptoms, it's characterized by a progressive decline in movement ability. Hallmark signs and symptoms include incoordination, imbalance, impaired gait, impaired motor learning. And those symptoms contribute to an array of functional limitations, loss of independence, increased risk for falls, and ultimately increased medical dependency. There is no cure, and it's considered to be a progressive and irreversible disease. So we know that even though there's no cure, rehabilitation stands as that cornerstone sort of intervention to be able to help people with spinocerebellar ataxia. And in fact, rehabilitation interventions hold great promise for improving physical function and delaying disease progression. However, research specifically into SCA and rehabilitation remains limited. There is and that's especially so for remote and hybrid interventions. So why do I even bring that up? I think that there's a glaring issue, of course, with the pandemic. We want to make sure that our patients are going to be safe. But what we found from turning everything remote is that it improves access, it diversifies our sample, we get a greater understanding of the disease progression because it doesn't just happen in one particular group. It happens in a multitude of groups. And so that makes our results more generalizable. There's the potential for our results to be translated and implemented clinically quite readily. So in terms of the rehab approaches, like I said, there are very few studies investigating remote rehabilitation interventions, but what we do know is that rehab can improve functional mobility, measures of coordination and balance, and that continuity of training is absolutely critical. And that's another push for the remote rehabilitation intervention. So let's dive a little bit deeper in terms of the balance training. So we know that balance training reduces the risk of falls in neurodegenerative diseases in older adults. And highly challenging balance training programs actually can enhance motor ability in neurodegenerative diseases. And so that's a piece of that neuroplasticity, that piece of neurorehabilitation that we need to have it individualized, task specific, and highly challenging to evoke any change that's going on in the brain. So going on a little bit further, in particular with spinocerebellar ataxia, like I had said, there are some differences with them because they have impaired motor learning, as well as, of course, balance and gait impairments. And so what Amy Bastian and Suzanne Morton did back in 2006 was absolutely that light bulb moment where balance training was actually proven to be more effective than just gait training alone at improving gait in people with spinocerebellar ataxia. And to me, that was a huge piece that we're actually going to be carrying through with this intervention. In terms of the aerobic exercise, we know that vigorous intensity aerobic exercise, as investigated in other neurodegenerative diseases, highly so with Parkinson's, has led to increased angiogenesis, release of neuroprotective factors, increased neuroplasticity, and enhanced motor and cognitive function. But what about exercise for spinocerebellar ataxia? Well, there are 2 studies. So there was one that found that exercise was safe, which is great. And the other actually was a remote exercise intervention that was of vigorous intensity, and that was shown to be safe and effective. So moving on from there, recent rehab literature actually supports priming aerobic exercise to enhance task-specific motor training in individuals with neurodisorders. But what exactly does that mean? So aerobic exercise in neurodegenerative diseases, the question is, should we prime or should we consolidate? So just as a definition, you guys probably already know this, but priming is the use of aerobic exercise prior to intensive task-specific training, and that has been shown to enhance motor learning. Consolidating is the use of aerobic exercise post-intensive task training, and that enhances consolidation and motor memory deposition. So for the purpose of this particular study, given that we have individuals that have impaired motor learning, impaired balance, this is sort of our evolution of thought, where we have the aerobic exercise can just open those floodgates to enhance neuroplasticity, but it's difficult to maintain vigorous intensity aerobic exercise for long periods of time. So the question is, what about introducing HIIT, high intensity interval training? Could that be more receptive to our patients? And then priming, of course, over consolidation because of its motor learning benefits for spinocerebellar ataxia. Again, balance training over other gait-related training programs. And then can this be done remotely? So that leads me to my purpose. Could aerobic exercise, in fact, prime the brain to enhance motor learning for enhanced functional independence? That's the big question of thought. And our hypothesis is that activation of those neural circuitries following aerobic exercise can lead to downstream retention of cognitive and motor skills, and that can provide that crucial link to enhance motor performance while facilitating motor learning in individuals with spinocerebellar ataxia. We also know that exercise interventions are optimally positioned as both not only an intervention to slow disease progression, but also to evaluate the responsiveness of outcome measures in a use for potential clinical trials in the future. So our significance, well, prior efforts to restore normal functioning in SCA specifically have been incredibly hindered by that destructive nature of the disease process. And as these patients can commonly exhibit profound motor learning deficits. So the use of motor priming offers an opportunity to change the disease course, address those deficits in motor learning, and improve functional independence within this disabling disease. So our study aim is to determine the feasibility of a remotely delivered 8-week high-intensity exercise intervention for the purpose of motor priming in individuals with SCA. The plan is to evaluate initially recruitment, retention, and adherence rates, as well as acceptability of the remotely delivered exercise intervention. So testing it out, we're going to have a multiple baseline design and then pre and post measures. Our methods of inclusion, of course, we're choosing to go with adults with SCA 1, 2, 3, 6, and 7, which are their most common. They have to be showing clinical signs of cerebellar ataxia, and that would be rated on the SARA scale. They have to have ability to safely ride an exercise bike and walk with or without an assistive device, and a caregiver needs to be present. Exclusion criteria is, of course, any additional neurological disease or cardiopulmonary disease that would prohibit them from engaging in exercise. So in terms of our intervention, we have the high intensity interval training and the intensive balance training. Total time will be 60 minutes per session, twice a week for 8 weeks for a total of 16 sessions, all via telehealth. Diving in deeper, aerobic exercise, we're going to have the 5 minutes of warm up followed by 30 minutes of HIIT training and then 5 minutes of cool down. We chose an exercise intensity between 65 to 85% of heart rate reserve. And that was chosen based on prior studies investigating HIIT training specifically in neurodegenerative diseases. The participants will be wearing a Fitbit Charge heart rate device for monitoring intensity and activity, and the rating of perceived exertion scale as well as heart rate will be conducted and documented every 5 minutes. In terms of the balance training, we'll have 20 minutes of balance training that will be individually tailored to each participant. It's at that just right challenge for them. And that's going to include static measures as well as dynamic, depending on whatever their functional level is. And these balance training programs will be in part based on previously used training protocols for SCA, as well as other neurodegenerative diseases. In terms of our outcome measures, we have disease-specific measures, including the CERA scale, as well as Cerebellar Cognitive Affective Scale, both of which will be administered by our study neurologist. We will have digital biomarkers of function, including the timed up and go test and the static postural sway test. And we're actually using Encephalog, which is a smartphone app from Montfort, which they're based out of Israel. And we're hoping to validate that for spinocerebellar ataxia. And in terms of physical fitness, we'll be doing a modified CPET and of course the continuous heart rate monitoring. And then patient-reported outcomes include the ABC scale and the neural quality of life. Then of course the standard metrics and measures of feasibility, recruitment, adherence, retention, acceptability. In terms of our clinical implications, this project will provide knowledge on the feasibility of measuring clinical outcomes and delivering an exercise intervention while remotely and additionally developing functional biomarkers for clinical trial readiness and SCA. This is one part to a series of different interventions. So you guys, I guess, will have to just sort of stay tuned for that. So I open the floor to any questions you have.
Thank you so much, Chelsea. That is a promising study that's going on. The question, there's an open question. If you want to post question, audience can ask question. I have a quick question. So this is like all things remotely, right?
It's all remote.
Yeah, and what is the mechanism that you are thinking that if you have the high intensity, it may change the ataxia? Like what's the biological, is there any biological evidence for that?
There have been sort of studies in the past about trying to enhance the ataxia from exercise, but it's primarily from just increasing what we're going to be doing is collecting blood eventually, and also be doing, there's a potential for a cerebellar EEG, but we're still trying to figure that out to better understand the pathophysiological nature of what's going on. So there's not, right now in the cerebellar literature, there's not really the best defined path to be able to understand this mechanism. So that's why we're trying to investigate a little bit further.
Awesome. There's a question, Joe asked that I would like to know the encephalogram use of the phone gyros. Do you have a comment on that?
Of the encephalog
use of the phone gyro.
Oh, the frontal gyrus?
The phone, cell phone.
Oh, phone. Oh my gosh, I'm sorry.
Yeah. No.
Yeah, so it's actually, it's a typical iPhone app, and all of the data is sort of securely documented within this app. And I'm happy to send you the link in the resource to Encephalog, because it's a relatively new app that's come out, and it does measure, of course, the tug test as well as static sway. But what happens is the patients actually have a chest strap, and so they put their smartphone onto their chest and they perform all of the tests that way. And then all of the data is just immediately sent to their site in Israel, where then they generate out a list of the outcomes for that. So I'm happy to send that along.
Sure. I see as also Joe sent us the email. Thank you so much. That was great. And we are actually run out of the time.